Number 7. Alex Davis. After talking on the dating app Grindr, 18-year-olds Brian Heelis and Alex Davis arranged to see each other in person in Parbold, Lancashire, England. The former suggested a discreet spot in the woods that was halfway between their homes for their first meeting on April the 29th of 2019. When they reached the top of Parbold Hill, Heelis brandished a kitchen knife. He then unleashed a savage and relentless attack on Davis, stabbing him roughly 128 times. He was still alive when Heelis dragged him face down through the mud and covered him with branches and leaves. Davis died in the woods with a subsequent post-mortem listing asphyxia and multiple stab wounds as the primary factors. Shortly after the murder, Heelis was captured on CCTV riding his mountain bike away from the crime scene with his victim's rucksack on his back. In the days that followed, Heelis contacted 4 other men on Grindr, with investigators later suspecting that he'd intended to kill again. Fortunately, he was taken into custody from his Chorley home on May the 3rd. Law enforcement found the victim's headphones, spear phone, and wallet with Heelis's bank card inside, which he'd reportedly kept as trophies. Over the course of the trial that followed, mental health experts examined Heelis and agreed that he was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia at the time of the killing. Jurors, however, rejected the idea that his mental state had diminished Heelis's responsibility for the murder. He'd taken a knife to the meeting spot and stole Davis's 2 cell phones, wiping their memory. A judge called him a manipulative, calculating, and devious person before sentencing him to a minimum of 24 years in prison. Number 6. Nona Belomsov. Australian animal lover Nona Belomsov started talking to a man named Jason Green on Facebook in February of 2010. He offered the 18-year-old an opportunity to work with an animal welfare group, but told her that she first had to go camping overnight with him and other workers as part of her training for the job. Belomsov and her family believed the offer to be genuine, unaware that Jason Green was a complete fabrication. A man named Christopher Danevig, aged 20, set up the profile specifically to lure Belomsov into the bush. At the time, he was on probation for kidnapping another female teenager at knife point, tying her up and taking her into the wilderness. Whatever he'd been planning to do to her was thwarted by the intervention of 2 bystanders. Belomsov headed for the overnight camping trip in southwest Sydney on May the 12th of 2010. Her family reported her missing the following morning when they didn't hear back from her. The teenager's lifeless body was subsequently found lying face down in a creek at the Smith Creek Nature Reserve. Danevig was arrested in the aftermath and admitted to creating the fake profile, but initially claimed that he'd blacked out for most of the camping trip and found her lying in the water. Upon further questioning, he confessed to drowning her. In August of 2012, he was sentenced to at least 21 years in prison, with the presiding judge concluding he'd committed a most heinous crime. Number 5. Marta Calvo. In November of 2019, Spanish woman Marta Calvo arranged for an in-person rendezvous with a man she'd met on an online dating site. 25-year-old Calvo was reported missing on November the 7th after heading out to the man's rented home near the port city of Valencia on the country's southeastern coast. She had reportedly sent the address to her mother beforehand, and a subsequent investigation linked the woman's disappearance to convicted Colombian drug dealer Jorge Ignacio Palma. A manhunt was launched, and 37-year-old Palma, who in the past had been arrested for trafficking illegal substances in Spain and Italy, eventually surrendered to the authorities roughly a month later. He admitted to dismembering Calvo and dumping her remains at various bins in the municipality of Manuel and its surrounding areas. As of the latest updates, law enforcement was still trying to locate the woman's body. Palmer denied murdering her, but instead maintained he'd woken up to find her dead after she'd overdosed on the highly pure powdered drugs that he'd supplied. He claimed that she'd died following a so-called fiesta blanca, which reportedly involves drugs and intercourse, after which he panicked, cut her up, and disposed of the pieces. Spanish authorities, however, described Palmer as a serial killer and conclusively connected him to the death of 2 escorts, although it was suspected he'd killed more elsewhere in Europe. The man, who'd subsequently be nicknamed The Butcher by the press, was charged with the murders of Colombian escort Lady Marcela Vargas and Brazilian escort Arlene Ramos. Palmer's modus operandi reportedly involved introducing drugs in the women's genitals without their consent to subdue and kill them. In 2022, he was found guilty for the death of Calvo, Vargas, and Ramos, in addition to being convicted of trying to kill 6 other women in a similar manner. He was sentenced to 160 years in prison. Number 4. Susan Perry. In October of 2018, British woman Susan Perry received a message from a stranger named Gideon on Facebook. By her own admission, the 73-year-old felt like she was lacking spontaneity and excitement in her marriage to husband Gordon. Gideon, a handsome oil rig worker from San Francisco, seemed genuinely interested in her, and they began chatting for hours every day. At one point, he called her, and Susan noted he had a French accent and a soft, gentle voice. She fell for him and believed his promises of them starting a new life together in the US. Before long, Gideon experienced a series of personal crises and asked Susan for money in solving them, assuring her that he'd pay her back upon receiving his lucrative oil rig checks. One of the first emergencies consisted of his teenage son, Paul, having been involved in a car accident and needing life-saving surgery. Perry would send him money several times for Paul's treatment. She transferred him thousands of pounds on another occasion after Gideon had convinced her that pirates had raided his oil rig and he needed to airlift his men via helicopter. Susan was relieved upon learning that because of her help, they were all safe. With Paul's operations, the oil rig incident, and other requests, Susan had sent Gideon close to £40,000, exhausting her bank account and life savings. She had resorted to taking out loans and pawning off jewelry when she had nothing more to give. After he'd told her that the money he owed was on its way, Susan received a call from Paul claiming that his father had died of a heart attack in his sleep. She felt heartbroken by the news, and it was only after the police showed up to her Blackfield home that Susan accepted she'd been scammed. Officers told her that Gideon and Paul's photos were likely fake, and that she was one of hundreds targeted with the scam. Once Susan's husband learned of the incident, he decided to remain by her side and help recover the money she'd given away. In the aftermath of her plight, the woman had a staunch warning for others, stating, "Never fall for someone you meet on social media." Number 3. Shelley. In the fall of 2017, a blind woman, only identified as Shelley, bonded with a stranger while traveling by bus from Sudbury to Toronto, Canada. The latter, subsequently named as Angela Bluecoat, told her that she'd just gotten out of rehab and that she'd recently buried her mother. Bluecoat also mentioned that she had nowhere to stay while in Toronto. 49-year-old Shelley, who was planning to spend a few days in the city for medical treatment, invited Bluecoat to stay with her for the night at the Comfort Inn in North York. When she woke up at 5 a.m. the following day, Shelley realized that the $800 she'd brought with her for food, lodging, and the ticket back were gone. She called out to Bluecoat, but received no answer. Shelley went to the front desk and learned that after robbing her, the woman had gotten into a cab and left. Toronto law enforcement released an older mugshot of Bluecoat, along with surveillance footage, and within days, she surrendered. She was charged with 1 count of theft under $5,000. Shelley later spoke to a local media outlet about the incident and, while holding back tears, said, "That wasn't nice. It was all money for my trip." Once news of her plight spread, the public quickly reacted and dozens offered to help her. A GoFundMe campaign raised several $1,000s, and a constable offered to drive the woman to and from her appointments. Today's topic was requested by Morgan. If you have any other topics you'd like to learn about, subscribe and let us know in the comments section below. Number 2. Rowdy Lane Maze. On July the 30th of 2022, Texas authorities arrested 31-year-old Justin Glenn Boswell in Rockdale as a main suspect in the death of Rowdy Lane Maze. 2 days earlier, Temple police responded to reports of a stabbing and found the latter with wounds to his neck and body. Before succumbing to his injuries, 25-year-old Maze had told a witness that he'd been knifed by a hitchhiker. he'd picked up from a nearby Taco Bell. Surveillance footage from the eatery showed Mays allowing the man to get into the bed of his pickup truck and later on, after parking, invited him in the front passenger seat. The hitchhiker stabbed Mays and then fled in his vehicle, which was ultimately found abandoned in Rockdale. Investigators later met with a man in Cameron who reported that he'd talked to Boswell at the fuel pumps of a gas station. He noted that he behaved strangely and wrote down the license plate of his vehicle, which proved a match for Mays' stolen pickup. Boswell, who had no fixed address at the time, was booked into the Bell County Jail on a bond of $1 million. In Mays' obituary, his grieving family wrote that they found comfort in knowing he lost his life helping someone. Number 1. Julie Price. Julie Price from Portsmouth, England, began talking to an American soldier online. On New Year's Eve 2018, Price, a single mother of 2, was in a vulnerable state at the time. She'd been severely impacted by the recent loss of her father, which had also led to the end of her previous relationship. Her online suitor, named Jonathan, wrote that he was stationed in Afghanistan. As their interaction progressed, he confessed his love for Price, a sentiment reciprocated by the woman then in her early 30s. Jonathan claimed that he needed iTunes and Amazon gift cards so that he could access the internet and keep talking to her. She sent him what he asked for without hesitation. Jonathan maintained that he couldn't use voice or video in their communication as he feared punishment from his commanding officer. Throughout their exchanges, he promised to buy Price a house in England and give her children the ideal life. The woman sold her car and jewelry, including her grandmother's engagement ring, to gather the money for a plane ticket so that Jonathan could fly out to the UK and finally meet her in person. She waited for him at the airport for 4 hours in June of 2019 before returning home in tears. Jonathan later told her he was sorry, adding that his commander had stopped him leaving at the last minute. He claimed to need more money to make the trip, and Price sent him several £1,000s over the months that followed. She finally confided in her mother in October of 2019, and the woman immediately realized that she'd been scammed, urging her to block Jonathan and change her banking details. Price was subsequently directed to an anti-scam group on Facebook. She saw a video of the man with whom she'd believed to have been talking. The real Jonathan Ramos, a member of the US Air Force with close to 100,000 Instagram followers, explained that scammers had been using his pictures to trick people online. Price reported that she was left utterly devastated. She never got her money back and shared her story to warn other women about the dangers of online romance scams. Thanks for watching. If you could press a button and instantly get $100,000 but know that a random person would lose their life savings, would you do it? Let us know in the comments section below.